Like always, this is going to be a brief look at a very complex topic, so we're sort of skimming the surface here. But this is a look at Black feminism focusing on the 1970s. It really begins with this question, liberation for who? It comes from a slightly different place than the white women's movement. About the same time, coming out of the same movements, but slightly different process. Because as the women's liberation movement that's dominated by white women develop, Black women, some of them have some sympathy for the movement, but they worry that it might cause tensions with Black men, that it might divert their energies from the civil rights movement. They distrust white women. Some Black women did join the mainstream women's liberation movement, but not most, and those who did had a somewhat difficult time. At the same time, you have Black women activists in the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement, and they began to challenge those movements, looking at them and asking, are they really providing liberation to Black women, whose labor, sexuality, submission were often just expected by Black male activists? And they're saying, is this really liberating for me? She explained it this way. I was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. You're talking about liberation and freedom half the night on the racial side, and then all of a sudden, men are going to turn around and start talking about putting you in your place. So in 1968, we founded the SNCC Black Women's Liberation Committee to take up some of these issues. And that group is later going to evolve into the Third World Women's Alliance. What makes it even harder is that we have the rebirth or the further development of the matriarchy myth. And to try to explain this, what brought it to the surface was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was working on a report in 1968 for the federal government. 1965. He was working on his 1965 report for the federal government, and actually he drew on the work of Black sociologists who had written, either Black male sociologists who had written about these issues before. And what he argued and published was that because of slavery, Black gender roles were reversed, giving power to Black women and emasculating Black men, resulting in female-headed households, thus destroying healthy family structure among Black people. And while a lot of organizations and Black people speak out against the Moynihan report, somehow the ideas sort of seep out, and you have a number of Black men who accuse Black women of taking their jobs, of being matriarchs who dominate the family, and that you need to reinsert patriarchy, male rule, in order to receive a healthy family, a healthy community, a healthy Black culture. And that idea is disturbing to a lot of Black women who become feminists. At the core of feminist organizing for Black women, as it was for white women, was consciousness raising. And that's this idea of coming together and speaking together and validating the reality of their experiences, and that these experiences were much bigger than just their personal lives and choices. As women described at the first meeting of the National Black Feminist Organization, they experienced the overwhelming feeling that after years and years, we had finally found each other. It basically set up in place the idea of saying, okay, these are the personal things that happened to me, and some of this has happened because of racism, but it also happens because of these structures of sexism that combine with racism, and it's these larger structures that we need to attack. It's not just one bad man or one stupid practice. It's a much larger structure, social structure, economic structure, political structure that is creating these problems for all these women. And Black feminists, as they evolve this thinking, begin to realize that they could come together and form organizations that would be independent of Black men and also independent of white women, that would focus on the particular oppression and survival issues that were faced by Black women. On the one hand, you have white feminists who basically argue, look, we're all sisters. We all have fundamentally the same problems, which are created by patriarchy. And Black feminists say, no, we don't have the same problems because you have racial privilege. You benefit from the system of racism, and you are not realizing the ways that your actions, even your feminist actions, are contributing to the issue of racism. So maybe one of the examples of this is one of the major goals for a lot of women in the women's liberation movement is to be able to go out and have careers and to compete with men for more high status jobs like being a lawyer or a college professor or a doctor or other positions. Well, the reality is for women to do that and also to have children, to have a family, frequently they have to have childcare. Childcare is critical, but the way childcare works usually is by paying very low wages to other women, frequently who are women of color. So for white women, their liberation is partly being subsidized by the oppression of poor women, frequently poor women of color. There's also a feeling by a lot of Black feminists that white feminists want to use them as tokens, that they want to steal their ideas, but they don't take them seriously. And you get a sense of this from this poem, Lorraine Bethel, What You Mean We, White Girl. And this is just a small section of it. We're not doing that kind of work anymore, educating white women, teaching colored her story 101, letting lesbian, feminist, racial transvestites, radical chic, European dykes wearing pouches and multiple earrings with no libations for Black female spirits pick our brain, steal our culture, style, identities, for free or below the minimum wage. For the revolution, of course. There are a number of Black women's feminist organizations that rise up, and I've got them listed here. You'll notice that there's a number of them, but they last about a decade or less. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. To be a Black feminist, there's a whole range of issues that mattered. And these were issues that were expressed by Black feminists through protests, through newsletters and other publications, through conferences and workshops and classes, through consciousness raising, eventually publishing. Some women even ran for public office. And the range of these issues included prisoners, particularly female prisoners, and Angela Davis, but also the experience of much more all the other Black women who are prisoners as well, and the oppression they experience. Domestic violence as a critical issue for Black women. Welfare rights, reproductive justice. And when you use the term reproductive justice, they mean more than just reproductive rights. It's not just a matter of having access to abortion or having access to birth control, though that is important. You need to have access to those things at an affordable price, safely performed, conveniently located, and more than that, for it to really be full reproductive justice, you need protection from sterilization that was being forced on women of color, or at least pressured on women of color. You need the support you need in terms of health care, income support, other kinds of support that's going to make it possible for you, if you choose to have children instead, that you can have those children safely and raise them well. So reproductive justice is about the whole range of questions, that you have a choice to not have children, and you have the safe tools that you need to do that, or to have children, and you have the tools that you need for that. The growing issue of drugs, the problem of poverty experienced by Black women, the issue of safety from violence and sexual assault, and finally the issue of health, which was an extreme problem for a lot of Black women who had much more greater health issues than white women on average, but also had problems with both access to health care, but also with being taken seriously by healthcare providers when they access it. So a lot of issues, all of which are spilling out under the concerns of Black feminists, trying to meet women, Black women, where they were and deal with the issues in their lives. The thing is, though, is they struggled with a lack of resources. The money pretty much came from fundraising, dues, so each member would pay, and usually it would be what they could afford. And sometimes there's an exception, a couple of times where they get outside grants. To hold this conference here, the National Black Feminist Organization actually got a couple of grants for that. But the problem is that there is a lot of concern within the movement that if they get grants, that they would then be influenced by the grant givers. And given that it would be white people who had the kind of funds to give grants, that would allow for white corruption of the Black feminist movement. So they're resistant to that. But the reality is, a movement that is trying to help Black women, many of whom are poor, depending on dues, is really hard. And in terms of getting help from the Black community, the Black church is pretty upset with a lot of what the Black feminists are arguing for. Black organizations like the NAACP are much more conservative. They're looking for integration. They don't like this idea of needing to change the whole social order. And so they're not going to be giving donations. So they really struggled with paying for their needs, which weren't really much. I mean, they had to pay for an office space, photocopies for flyers and other publications. Sometimes they would contribute to political prisoner defense funds, to help sponsor rallies and other events. But all that takes money, even if not a lot of money, and that was hard to come by. So as one feminist said, so we were going on and motivated by politics and youthful energy. So we conducted our politics in the cracks. We had part-time jobs that we didn't care very much about, and we basically made this our life. So that is not sustainable over an extended period of time. You can operate like that for a while with 20-year-olds and people in their early 30s, but after a while, that doesn't work anymore. And it was particularly tough for these organizations because, for the most part, they couldn't hire staff, or if they could, very minimally. So they depended on their members to do all this work. And their members, a lot of times, had actually started out in the civil rights movement. And so they'd plunge themselves into one movement, and then they plunged themselves into a new movement. And they're getting older, and they're starting to have children. And some of them are single mothers, and some of them are married and having children, but even in that case, their income is needed to help support the family. So it becomes really hard to just live for the revolution. And then there was the Reagan Revolution. Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980. And suddenly, a lot of people who had thought that there was a long ways to go, the revolution wasn't here yet, but maybe it was coming down the road, things were maybe getting better, there were changes in laws that seemed positive, and suddenly Ronald Reagan gets elected. And people are sitting there and looking at that and thinking, we're not headed towards a revolution after all. We've just hit a brick wall. The thing, though, is they actually, long term, didn't leave activism behind. Instead, they sort of dispersed. So some of them go on to become academics. And the study of Black feminism and Black feminist ideas in their work in the academy. A number of them go into other groups of social activism, and usually what it means is they target in on one of those many issues that the Black feminist groups thought were important. So some of them focus on health injustice and trying to build health clinics, trying to create opportunities, all that kind of thing. Some of them work on reproductive justice issues. Some of them work on women prisoners' rights. Some of them focus on rape hotlines, domestic violence, and on and on. But when they did a study recently of the Third World Women's Alliance, I think I've got that right, what the historian found was pretty much all of the women were still activists. They had just changed their official cause. And in a lot of ways, what they were fighting for still had those essential issues about Black women and feminism and the need to support the community that had always been there. Some of these are a little dry, but I could recommend We Were There, the Third World Women's Alliance in the Second Wave, is pretty readable.